Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the April 20th, 2017 meeting of the local ARSC chapter. Tonight we have a very special program because essentially we have a witness to the event that they are going to talk about, and I will explain as we go along. The title of the program is an interview with Gunther Schuller on his 7 studies on themes of Paul Klee. Tom Fine and Dennis Rooney will recall the world premiere that was performed on November 27, 1959, and the Mercury recording of it will also be heard. In 1959, Gunther Schuller was commissioned by Antal Doráti with the support of the Ford Foundation in conjunction with the American Music Center to compose a new work for the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra. 7 Studies on Themes of Paul Klee had its world premiere on November 27, 1959 in Northrop Memorial Auditorium on the Minneapolis campus of the University of Minnesota. The work, dedicated to Doráti and conducted by him, was subsequently recorded later that season and released by Mercury Living Presence. In attendance at the premiere was Dennis Rooney, then an undergraduate music major at U of M. Dennis would later get to know Schuller, meeting regularly with him in New York and at Tanglewood, and interviewing him for broadcasts. Their acquaintance began in the late 60s and continued until shortly before Schuller's death in 2015 at the age of 89. For this meeting, Dennis Rooney will perform virtual time travel, quote-unquote, interviewing Schuller, as he was in 1965. We will also hear the 1960 Mercury Living Presence premiere recording of Schuller's work, as performed by the commissioning orchestra and conductor. Dennis and Tom will provide a brief overview of Paul Klee, and his paintings that inspired Schuller's music will be shown. Additional artifacts of the premiere performance, local reviews, etc., will also be displayed. And Dennis will offer his memories and impressions as a member of the audience. This will be a rare opportunity to hear a composer talk in detail about his work, listen to the premiere recording, and hear firsthand accounts by an ARSC member who both attended the premiere performance and later became friendly with the composer. All right, a little bio, and then we will go from there. Dennis D. Rooney is co-chair of ARSC New York chapter. Since 1996, he served on the ARSC Technical Committee and reviews books and recordings regularly for the ARSC Journal. A professional career embracing journalism, classical record production, broadcasting, and narration has been accompanied by over 6 decades as a record collector. Discs from his collection are frequently used in CD historical reissues. As both a producer and archival and catalog exploitation consultant to the classical record industry, he developed and contributed to important classical reissue lines for Sony Classical, Universal Classics, and Vox. His writing on music, his writings on music have regularly appeared in the Strad for more than 30 years. He has also contributed to BBC Music Magazine, Musical Times, Classical Record Collector, The American Record Guide, and MusicalAmerica.com. Tom Fine is a member of ARSC and AES. He owns and operates an analog-to-digital audio transfer studio. With a primary base of archival and educational and institutional clients, he specializes in transferring magnetic and groove disc media to high-resolution digital formats. He is an avid collector. What else are we in this place? Of music recordings and a student of record industry history. Well, Mr. Rooney, Mr. Fine, it is all yours.
Thanks, Seth. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. This should be an interesting program. Get started. So this is basically the running order of things. I'm going to give a little background on how this came about, and Dennis is going to talk about Gunther Schuller and this composition. I'm just going to give a little background on Paul Klee so you understand the relationship between the art and the music. And then we're going to play back Dennis's time travel interview with Gunther Schuller, and then Dennis is going to talk about attending the premiere. And then we're going to hear the premiere recording in its entirety. So for background, this is a classic ARSC story. I was given a collection of classical records by an old friend of mine, and among them was this RCA recording of the work in question. and my first impression was typical annoyance with RCA copying Mercury years later, but I was intrigued by the presentation of the album. It was somewhat similar to Mercury in that they used one of the 7 studies on the cover, and Gunther Schuller wrote the liner notes about his piece. But it was different, and the performance was very different than the Doráti performance. I wanted to know more about how this came about. Why Schuller would kind of put his endorsement on this RCA recording rather than the actual premiere recording. So I started Googling. I came across the existence of this, which is a production that RCA put out and sent around to classical radio stations. And basically, they cut out the questions of this interview that was conducted with Gunther Schuller and provided a script for the local radio station to seem to be interviewing Schuller in their studios. And it includes instructions on how to put the production together on the back, and then the front page of the script is shown on the left there. And so I thought about it. I thought, this is interesting. You don't usually get composers talking in detail about a work that I think should be played more and heard more. I mean, you could call this work somewhat obscure. I think it's a wonderful work. And I've been familiar with it since I was a kid because my mother took us to the Museum of Modern Art, and we saw the twittering machine. And of course, little kids see that drawing and immediately understand it. And she said, well, there's a piece of music that goes with that. And so this piece is one of the earliest pieces I remember knowing as a child, just from seeing the clay artwork. So I thought, what voice would work with this? Dennis Rooney. And so I sent Dennis an email that included a scan of the script, and I said, do you have any interest in doing this? I just want to make an audio production so people can hear Schuller talking about the work. Dennis comes back and says, I knew Schuller. I was at the premiere of this work, and I've known this work since it was written. And I said, there's an ARS presentation in this. Let's do it. So that's how we got to here. And this is the cover of what I grew up listening to, which is my parents' recording of it, the premiere recording. And you see the twittering machine right on the cover. So you can see how a little kid could make a full connection with this. You see it in the museum, you see it on the cover, you hear the music. All of a sudden, it all makes sense, even to a little kid's mind. And God bless my mother for dragging us to those art museums, because it took me well into adulthood to appreciate what we had been exposed to. So without further ado, Dennis is going to talk about Gunther Schuller, his friend.
Thank you, Tom. I met Gunther Schuller it wasn't until the late 60s. I had heard him interviewed. Meeting him reinforced my impression of him as intelligent but approachable. He looked about the way he looks in the upper left photo, right there, that one. He enjoyed conversing with those who could reach his level, and his interests were wide-ranging. When I discovered that he both knew and admired Pierre Monteux's 1929 recording of Le Sacre du Printemps, our relationship warmed. The first thing you noticed about Gunther was that he had a glass left eye. Being well brought up, one endeavored not to stare, but the eye gave him a perpetually quizzical gaze. In 1932, when he was 7, he'd been enrolled in an international children's school in Germany, and while there, lost his eye at 11 in a knife accident. He also was enrolled as an unwilling member of the Hitlerjugend. When he returned to New York, he began studying the horn with Robert Schulze, then fourth horn of the New York Philharmonic, having met him through his father, Arthur, a longtime member of the Philharmonic's violins. Gunther became so proficient on the horn so quickly that he could leave school and start jobbing. By 15, he played extra horn in the Philharmonic and the NBC Symphony, including the U.S. premiere of Dmitri Shostakovich's Leningrad Symphony that Arturo Toscanini conducted in 1942. Gunther was 16. His lifelong interest in jazz also began in his teens, when he used to listen to it on the radio while doing his homework. A life-changing epiphany, he remembered, was listening to Duke Ellington one night when he suddenly realized what great music it was. When he told his father that he thought Duke Ellington was at least as good as Beethoven, his father was aghast. When he was appointed principal horn of the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, he was the youngest person to hold such a position. It was in Cincinnati where his interest in jazz began to acquire the significance it would later occupy, and after 2 seasons with Eugene Goossens in Cincinnati, Gunther returned to New York and became principal of the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra, where he remained until 1959. And there's a wonderful photo coming up of the exterior of the Yellow Brick Brewery, which was the Metropolitan Opera to everyone until 1967. His Met post allowed him to begin seriously composing, which he told me was his real ambition, not playing an instrument. Technically a high school dropout, he was entirely self-taught. He devoured scores beginning in his teenage years when he could borrow them from the local branch library. Doing that, he said, and hearing the music around him when playing in the orchestra were his teachers. In the summer, when the Met was dark, he played in Broadway pit orchestras and composed steadily the rest of the time. After he left the Met Opera Orchestra, he devoted himself to composition. He was a composition professor at Yale University from 1963 to 1964. At Aaron Copland's invitation, he began teaching in 1963 at the Berkshire Music Center at Tanglewood and served as its artistic director from 1969 to 1984. Gunther was also president of the New England Conservatory from 1967 to 1977, where he made initial efforts to codify the connections between classical and jazz within an academic setting. Under his leadership, the conservatory became the first such institution to establish a degree-granting jazz program, which he founded in 1969. It became known as the Third Stream Program, in tribute to the name Gunther had coined in the 50s to characterize his efforts to fuse jazz and classical music. In addition to a book on the French horn, Gunther wrote 2 books on jazz and one that took a very jaundiced view of conductors. And tonight, we're going to take a closer look at Gunther's 7 studies on themes of Paul Klee. The work was commissioned by the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra as part of the American Music Center's commissioning series with a grant from the Ford Foundation. It premiered in November 1959, and Mercury Living Presence made the premiere recording of the work the following April. In the front of his score, Gunther dedicated the work to his old friend Doráti, conductor of the Minneapolis Symphony. On the right side of the slide is Gunther's hand-drawn illustration of the suggested orchestral seating arrangement for performance. We'll wait for Gunther to discuss his work in detail in the interview that's coming up.
Okay, I'm going to speak briefly about Paul Klee, whose works inspired the music you'll hear. This is a photo montage or photo collage of Paul Klee by Joseph Albers. I just saw this at the MoMA a couple of months ago. It was an interesting thing, and I thought this was a neat way to show Klee, to introduce him to you. That's him in his studio in 1929. I'm not going to read all of this. If you want a deep dive into Paul Klee, you can email me and I'll send you the slides. But basically, he was born in December 1879, died in June 1940, And music played a big part in his artwork. He was a trained musician, and he often warmed up playing the violin before he painted. And he was interested in Bach-type fugal music, how it related to the painting process. And the only other thing I would note from this slide is the quote, "All art is a memory of age-old things, dark things, whose fragments live on in the artist." I thought that was a neat quote. And so now let's listen to Dennis's time travel interview, a conversation with Gunther Schuller.
This is a conversation with Gunther Schuller. At the risk of sounding like a press agent gone berserk, let me say that Gunther Schuller is a very talented composer, a master performer on perhaps the most difficult instrument in the orchestra, the French horn, an eminent conductor of symphony orchestras, both here and in Europe, and perhaps one of the most intelligent men it's been my pleasure to talk to. Gunther, I should start by saying that your first claim to fame was as a boy soprano. Would that be accurate?
Well, I don't know whether I became famous. I did indeed sing in St. Thomas Choir School in New York City, and that lasted until my voice broke at the age of 14. I must say that this is not important to anyone except perhaps myself, because that's where I became conscious of wanting to become a musician.
Well, your father, Arthur, was a well-known musician in his own right with the New York Philharmonic for many years. Didn't he have a paternal ambition of having a son who followed in his footsteps?
Well, he tried, but as so often happens, the father is perhaps the person least equipped to teach the son. Because, I don't know I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know what happens, but I resisted tremendously learning piano or violin. His instrument happens to be the violin. And I couldn't be bothered with practicing, and all these things that the children do. But, and the first instincts towards wanting to become a musician were generated in the direction of wanting to become a composer.
Even back then, when you were just a choir boy?
Well, I was singing, and through the singing I became acquainted, as a matter of fact, with contemporary music, with what was then contemporary music. This is back in 1939, 40, 41. And I liked especially that new music that we did in the church. And somehow I thought, well, I'd like to try my hand at one of these Te Deums, with all these funny, kooky chords.
We'll come back to the kooky chords a little later, but I would like you to continue to describe your career. Your first instrument was the flute, wasn't it?
Yes. That happened very simply because one of my father's friends in the Philharmonic was a flutist, and when I became interested in, wanting to become some kind of an instrumentalist, my father said, all right, you don't seem to have the talent for the piano, really. You shouldn't play the violin because there are millions of violinists and they always get the least pay in an orchestra, so why don't we try flute? And I played that for about a year or two, going on past the period when my voice broke. Then one day my father came along with another friend from the orchestra who was a French horn player. And he said, why don't we try Gunther out on the horn? And it turned out that I had a natural ability for this instrument.
The French horn is often described as about the most difficult instrument for a player to control.
Yes, it is. It's an instrument which is difficult because you can never completely guarantee what you're going to do. And my father kept saying, if you turn out to be a really good French horn player, you'll do very well because there are very few good ones. And, well, far be it from me to say how good I was, but in fact, I studied for about 2 years, and lo and behold, I was able to go into the profession at the age of 16, playing with the Ballet Theatre Orchestra, which was conducted at that time by Antal Doráti. So I left high school, and I left all further education, and I have no diplomas, no degrees, no nothing to show for my education.
your formal education. I should imagine your real education isn't over yet.
No, I hope it never stops.
Do you feel that perhaps you're a better composer because you weren't bogged down in too much academic discipline?
Oh, I'm not advocating, and I think, after all, we're speaking about a time 20 or 25 years ago, or is it 30? And in those days, perhaps it was much more possible. Certainly, I wouldn't advocate it today. I think the degree has become much more important in our time than it was then. And, of course, it depends really what profession you're going into it. To become an orchestral musician or an instrumentalist, I don't think it's so important to have a degree. However, if you shouldn't make it and in that profession and you want to resort to, let's say, teaching at some point, you can hardly do it without the degree.
How old were you when you moved to Cincinnati and the orchestra?
Well, that was a year later. I was 17.
You must have been the youngest principal in the orchestra, if not in the entire country.
I certainly was. I played first horn there for 2 years. Eugene Goosens was the conductor. And, of course, Goosens was also a rather respected composer. And this was especially rewarding and interesting for me on two counts because he played a lot of new music. And, you know, I had a conductor with whom I could talk about composition as such. And at that formative stage of my life, I think this was quite important to me.
If you recall that time in your life, do you feel as a composer that the feeling of rebellion, this desire to flout convention, was as strong then as it is now?
No, it certainly wasn't. The situation has changed so drastically in these 20 or 30 years, in many, many ways. Certainly there is much more activity now, and there's much more of what you've referred to as a sort of rebellious spirit. And in these 30 years, I can't tell you how many, perhaps dozens of new directions and new conceptions of composing have come into being. And in my youthful days, there were perhaps 2 or 3 choices you could make in which way you were going to be. And I can pin that down. You could decide whether you wanted to be a neoclassic composer in those days and follow more or less in the footsteps of Stravinsky and Aaron Copland and various other composers in that area.
Yes, and how about people like Howard Hanson and Samuel Barber?
Well, no, Hansen was still more conservative. But let's say, like Stravinsky and Copland, those were the 2 leaders of that camp, so to speak. Or you could decide, and which is what I decided, to follow the other direction, which is so-called 12-tone music, and the leaders of which were Schoenberg and Berg and Webern. Nowadays, you have to decide, a young composer coming, into maturity has to decide whether he wants to be, for example, an electronic composer, work only with the electronic medium. Or if he decides, well, I'll write for the orchestra and human beings, whether you want to be a serial technique composer, or whether you still want to write in the neoclassic idiom, or whether you want to write in the so-called aleatory idiom, which has to do with chance and improvisatory techniques, or whether you want to work with a computer. You see, these are all very fundamental decisions which one now has to make. One, of course, can say also, well, I want to do all of them, but I think that's practically impossible, purely physically. But you have to make these basic decisions. Now, in my day, you really didn't have. There was no choice, in fact, of whether you wanted to be an electronic composer, music composer, because there was no electronic music, you see.
Have you listened to it? Have you dabbled in electronic music yourself?
I certainly have listened to, I think, probably everything that's available, and I am very interested in it. And I even would go so far as to say I feel that there are some rather remarkable compositions already existent in the electronic music field. And I say this because many people just put it off as some kind of new fad, and it's really not music, and it's mechanical, and it's mathematical, and all of that. I don't happen to agree with that. I think some of it is, But that's simply because it's bad music or unimaginative music or done in some kind of mechanical way.
Since we're moving toward qualitative opinions here, Gunther, perhaps you'd help me characterize the composer John Cage. Where does he fit in?
Well, John Cage, of course, has also worked with electronic music. He's also worked with ordinary instrumental music, and he's also worked, perhaps more than anyone else, with what I referred to before as aleatory music, chance music. In fact, he is probably could be called the father of this music. So he covers a very wide spectrum, which is not definable by any particular idiom or style as such. In fact, I don't know whether it's definable at all, but it certainly goes across many areas, many categories of music.
Well, we all know about the theater of the absurd. Is this maybe music of the absurd?
I would say so. After all, Cage's latest manifestations are very much involved with all kinds of visual and theatrical aspects. And this is a very controversial area in music at the moment.
But that's also what makes it exciting.
This goes into a whole nother area, and it in fact overlaps into the area of the happenings and what you refer to as the theater of the absurd. I'm not sure that it's altogether absurd. On the other hand, I cannot condone everything that I've seen or heard from this particular group of composers. I find some of it absolute fraud. I find some of it absolute sham. Some of it I find mildly entertaining. Some of it I find very provoking. You know, it's an area in which there are at the present moment, in my opinion, no standards, no criteria. Therefore, you get an awful lot of fraud, if to be very blunt about it. This can't be helped. That is not to say, however, that everything that's done in that area is fraud.
A true apostle of the open mind. But let me put you on the spot. There's a young lady, quite pretty, who plays cello, whom I've seen on TV a couple of times playing cello and shooting guns and breaking glass and myriad other antics. You can't relate this to John Cage, can you?
Are you referring to the Johnny Carson show where a cellist by the name of Charlotte Moorman appears? She's doing essentially the same kind of thing.
Yes, but isn't she put on?
Well, I might agree with you, but you'd be surprised when you talk to the Cage people. They have a whole philosophy or rationale for this whole thing, and it's a very interesting one. That's why I keep emphasizing the fact that I can't really discuss it on musical terms, because the precepts on which it's based are so totally different from those which we've associated with music. Because you see, what John Cage really is talking about is he wants to make music not an activity separate from everyday life, but in fact part of everyday life. Therefore, he's very happy when various noises, natural noises, whether it's the rain on the roof or people sneezing or people stumbling as they get in their seat or who knows what, when these sounds become a part of the performance. You see, another musician is shocked. He says, well, my great music is being disturbed. John Cage says this music is all part of a time and space in which we live, and I don't want to separate this as a separate artistic activity. You see, he rules out the word art. That's why people refer to it as non-art, and some do it facetiously. But he means it seriously in the sense that it is not a separate endeavor to isolate art from other activities. You see, and this, of course, comes from Zen Buddhism. And in that sense, I keep emphasizing, it is a totally different philosophy. And we can get all hung up if we want to discuss it on purely musical terms, because there are no criteria by which you can discuss it on purely musical terms.
I see. I think you reached the heart of the matter, and I must say I'm beginning to understand how you can relate these things artistically. When we digressed into the music of John Cage, you were playing first horn in Cincinnati. Can we get back on the track of your career You came back to New York and the orchestra of the Metropolitan Opera.
That was 2 years after going to Cincinnati. Of course, New York was my home, and my parents were anxious for me to come back to New York. And again, I auditioned for the Metropolitan Opera for Mr. Zell, who was at that time musical director. And I was engaged, and then I stayed 14 and a half years.
14 and a half years playing opera repertoire? Didn't you find that just a bit dull?
Not at all. It was a very exciting part of my life. And I'd like to say something here, which I could apply also to my experience in Cincinnati. And it's this, that I'm often asked, well, you're a composer, but who did you study with? And as you can surmise from this brief biography, I didn't study with anybody. I am, in fact, what you refer to as being self-taught. But with this qualification, my teacher was the orchestra, were the orchestras in which I played, and the great music which I played. That is to say, I learned more from playing, the great symphonies and the great operas with great conductors and with great singers than I think you can learn secondhand from a teacher, unless he's the most inspired, composer, teacher. Then those are very rare.
Then you were composing during those 15 years with the Metropolitan Opera?
Oh, yes, all the time.
And among these compositions was one of your early commissions, the 7 studies on themes of Paul Klee. That was a commissioned work, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, this coincides more or less with the time when I was leaving the Met. I can't recall now exactly whether I had already left or not, but it's sort of one of the pieces that, made the decision really imperative to decide, either be a composer or not. This was a commission which was given jointly by 3 institutions, the Ford Foundation, the Minneapolis Symphony, and the American Music Center. And they all coordinated their various ideas about this, and actually the choice of the composers, I believe, was made by the orchestras involved in this project. There were many orchestras involved, and it so happened, by luck, the Minneapolis Symphony and its director, Antal Doráti, again, my old friend from my ballet theater days, picked me and asked me to write an orchestral piece.
Well, let's get down to cases. In this work, you've combined the familiar with the fresh in a way that is most distinctly your own. Let's start with the picture called Arab Village. Can you tell us, Gunther, what we will be hearing?
Well, this very simply is a painting in which the viewer finds himself floating, so to speak, above an Arab village. And taking that as a point of departure, I decided, well, I'm going to put the listener in that position up there above this village, where he might hear at the edge of the village a flute player sitting and just playing by himself some soliloquy, and where he might hear in the distance an Arab oboe playing another piece, and where there might be all kinds of other musical sounds intermixed with this. And you hear it as a kind of collage. And these musics happen simultaneously. The flute plays off in the distance while the oboe is also playing. And there's this whole interplay between foreground and background material. And then the other thing that I can say about it is here I really went out of my own, what I hope is a personal idiom, and went into authentic Arab scales and Arab music.
Let's listen to this performance of Arab Village. We're talking with Gunther Schuller about his composition 7 Studies on Themes of Paul Klee. In the translation of something purely visible to something purely audible, Gunther, I get the impression that you're repainting the same picture rather than trying only to express the philosophy behind it.
Yes, the emphasis with me was, in at least 3 of these pieces, on the structural elements in the clay paintings.
You mean you used different techniques depending on the circumstances?
Well, yes, some of them didn't lend themselves so well to a literal structural translation into musical terms. For example, the Little Blue Devil. I mean, there was nothing in the structural technique used by Klee which I could translate into a musical technique, counterpoint or polyphony or whatever. But in Antique Harmonies, there was a translation possible, also in Pastorals, the last one. Now, I tried as much as possible always to relate my music to these structural aspects rather than just to a sort of, trying to recapture the mood of the title or the feeling of the painting, because that is not only a bit vague, but also belongs to a whole way of thinking about music which we, as a rule, in music today no longer believe in. And I'm referring to the whole tone poem idea of the late 19th century.
I've been sort of skirting Mussorgsky and his pictures at an exhibition.
I appreciate that. I do feel that I at least attempted a quite a different orientation vis-a-vis the paintings than Mussorgsky did, because there was a matter of capturing a certain mood and going from the title only. And of course, those paintings were of such a nature that you couldn't, in fact, relate musically to anything structural in the paintings. But as I say, in the case of Klee, you could do that. And as much as it was possible, I did so.
Of course, Klee was an abstractionist, which starts us off on a whole new track. Let's talk about Little Blue Devil. How should we tune our ears?
Well, the Little Blue Devil happens to be a jazz piece, or what we might refer to as a third stream music piece.
Tell me about third stream music.
Oh, well, the third stream, very, very briefly, is something I've been very much involved with. In fact, I coined the term, sometimes to my regret, because it's become such a slogan. But it is a music which attempts to bring together in the most essential and fundamental ways, and these are terribly big words, but I can't make it simpler, the music of jazz and the music of, advanced classical music. And I emphasize the word essential because I'm not interested in a sort of superficial borrowing of cliches from one world and just sort of transplanting them into the other world. And this can only be done really by musicians and composers who are deeply involved and equally involved in both areas, jazz and non-jazz. That, in essence, is third stream. It's a rather large category by now, and there are many ways of constituting this, but that's the general idea.
Okay, you started by saying the Little Blue Devil was third stream. How did you happen to cast it in this particular idiom?
I thought about this funny little geometric figure, this head, which Klee calls a little blue devil, and I thought, how can I characterize this in music? And the angular geometric shape of this head eventually caused me to think of a certain perky, angular jazz theme. There's something terribly humorous and funny and comical and at the same time sad in this Klee painting, and I tried to capture some of that atmosphere and mood in this theme. Besides that, the association of the word blue, of course, is very strong in jazz, because not only from the word blues, but there are composers like Ellington who have literally dozens of pieces which have the word blue in the title. And in fact, Ellington sort of worked out a sound, a sonority in his orchestra which is referred to as a blue sound. And not the blues sound, but a blue sound. And I worked a great deal with that in this piece, too. And I think that's about all there is to it. After that, it's just a matter of developing several what we call choruses, of music. However, I must emphasize here that this is written for a symphony orchestra and not for jazz musicians, and there is no improvisation. I wish there could have been, but as symphony orchestras today are constituted, they generally cannot improvise, in the real jazz idiom. So every note is written in an attempt to recapture some of the inflection and feeling and spontaneity of jazz.
Very good, and I think this is just the time to hear it. Gunther Schuller's impression of Paul Klee's painting, Little Blue Devil. Gunther, would you annotate this next piece for us, The Twittering Machine?
Well, this picture is one in which there really was hardly anything in the structure given to translate into musical terms. So this is really an attempt merely to capture the whimsical, humorous mood of this famous painting.
But there's a bird involved.
Well, there are in fact several birds. It depicts this imaginary machine, sort of wire structure with a handle on one end, and these funny little different kinds of birds sitting on them, presumably mechanical birds. And the idea, of course, is that when this handle is rotated, these birds begin twittering. and again, presumably in a wild, cacophonic, arrhythmical kind of pattern.
Putting it that way doesn't make it sound as well as funny as it really is. What kind of form did you use?
I thought it was very apropos to take a technique which is often maligned by the layman as being mechanical and mathematical, and apply it in this piece in a sort of humorous way. And I'm referring to the so-called serial technique. And we won't go into that because that's a long 2.5-hour lecture. But what it means is to subject to a certain degree of systematization of various aspects of music, such as rhythm, dynamics, pitch, timbre, and so on. And you subject it to a kind of arithmetic process, you see. And this piece, in fact, is conceived that way, and it comes out as a kind of wild twittering, and of course is orchestrated in twittering-type instruments, flutes, oboes, and high violins, and some percussion instruments, like a woodpecker pecking away at a tree trunk. And all of this is done in this sort of quasi-mechanical way, and when I say it's apropos, I think it's apropos technically, but I hope also apropos humorously, because certainly this is one of Klee's funniest pictures, and it is quite a comment on the mechanization of the world, and automatization that we're going through. And this piece is a sort of musical commentary on that as well.
So it's all right to laugh. We don't have to pull a long face when we listen to the twittering machine.
Indeed, and I was very delighted when at the first performances people did what they usually don't dare do in a symphony hall, and that is laugh.
In talking to Gunther Schuller about the music he has written, I get the strong impression of his awareness not only of everything that's going on in music, but of everything else in the world, too. Gunther, your strong reaction to painting, for instance, in translating this picture of Klee's, the one called Eerie Moment, what were you trying to achieve? Or perhaps, since we don't know the painting itself, you might describe it for us.
Well, it's almost amounts to a line drawing in which there are these slinky figures that are just, as I say, lines, they're almost bodiless. And they're in fact quite eerie. And you have this whole feeling of suspense, of impending doom, these figures are moving towards. Here again, I departed largely from the title in the Mussorgsky tradition, I suppose, in that I tried to create a very short piece of music which was, for the first 7/8 of it, suspended in its feeling. You know, you can't quite tell what is going to happen. You have the feeling that something dreadful is going to happen, and there's this sort of deathly stillness in the music, and very little activity, and everything in a sort of static way. And then suddenly comes this absolutely unexpected outburst and climax in the orchestra, and it lasts only for one eerie moment and is gone in a matter of seconds, and the whole piece sort of collapses back into the silence with which it started.
I wonder if there is some way you could distinguish where the line of demarcation is between what you've done here and music for a suspenseful moment in the movies that Hollywood composers of underscoring seem to produce by the yard.
I see what you're getting at. Well, it's very difficult for me to answer that, except by sort of patting myself, by implication, on the back. It ultimately becomes a matter of how pure and how original your conception is, you see. And if there is a difference between my music, an eerie moment music like this, and let's say some film score, it should be, and I hope it is, in the realm of the dimensions beyond the technique.
Could I restate it more boldly? That what you have done is create purely to your own standards of taste without any other consideration? But we can each make our own judgments. Let's listen to Gunther Schuller's An Eerie Moment. Relating to my earlier question, Gunther, the difference between serious music written for symphonic exposure, that is, what you do, and the music created as background scores for films. Some feel that film composers don't get the credit they deserve outside the commercial world. You say there's a difference, if I understand correctly, and you pinpoint it as creativity.
Yes. Now, mind you, some of these Hollywood composers are immensely skillful people, and this is, in fact, their main profession. But they are often beset by various pressures which have to do, with many other considerations in the making of a film. For instance, very often they have to write 2.5 minutes of music exactly. Now, in my piece, I didn't have to do this. There are all kinds of extra freedoms which I enjoy as a composer of abstract music that is not geared to a film.
Let's turn to another of your Klee studies, Pastoral. Tell us about the original picture.
Pastoral was subtitled Rhythms by Klee, and it is again one of these remarkable pictures in which the viewer of the picture has to actually read it like a page of writing in a book. And what he is reading when he reads it is a variational process, because in this picture, Klee has taken certain tiny little geometric figures, triangles, lines, funny little figures, which he thought of as evoking trees and bushes and plants and so on. And they're all done on a green background, and there's a little bit of blue sky in the top of the picture. And these geometric figures all are different from each other, just as in nature. Each rose is in some minute, subtle way different from any other rose, or each plant, and so on. So there's this subtle variational process, and since he did it in sort of horizontal layers, your eye is invited to read this picture from left to right, going across these lines. And as you do this, and this is why he called it rhythms, a rhythm is set up in your viewing of it. And there is, in fact, a visual rhythm in the picture, from figure to figure. And I took this idea and created a certain rhythmic pattern and varied it in these similarly subtle ways. And then to further give the feeling of the pastoral character, I used those instruments associated in the 19th century primarily with pastoral music, namely the French horn and the clarinet. So they carry the main melodies in the piece.
Thank you, Gunther Schuller. Now let's listen to this performance of Pastoral from Schuller's 7 studies on themes of Paul Klee.
Okay, so we've experienced time travel, and now back to the real reality here. Dennis is going to talk about attending the premiere performance in Minneapolis.
From 1949 to 1960, Antal Doráti conducted the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra. Minneapolis was where I spent my childhood and adolescence. In his first seasons, I heard him a few times at MSO children's concerts. It was great. You had the afternoon off, paid 50 cents for a ticket, and rode a yellow bus to Northrop Memorial Auditorium on the University of Minnesota campus, and then would be dropped off near home after the concert ended. Children's concerts in those days were real concerts, albeit shortened, and would include an appearance by the week's soloist, who usually played a concerto movement. Doráti became known in his MSO years for often performing new works, many of which he commissioned. In high school, my opportunities to hear the orchestra were limited, except for those guest conductors like Pierre Monteux and Malcolm Sargent, whose recordings attracted me. By 1959, I was an undergraduate music major at the University of Minnesota. The announcement that Doráti would perform the premiere of a new work by Gunther Schuller was making the rounds of the music department and sounded intriguing. I obtained a cheap ticket, maybe $1.50, for the concert. Such seats were either located hard left or hard right on the main floor or in the back of the balcony, but I quickly found a better empty seat in the middle of the main floor. It wasn't hard, because it was the day after Thanksgiving, and many subscribers were not in their seats, either because of the holiday or the fact that Doráti had programmed all modern music, the prospect of which gave the more timid burghers a reason to stay home. And it was also a chilly night. The Schuller premiere was on the second half of the program. William Schumann's violin concerto was played by Raphael Druyan, the concertmaster, and was preceded by the Holofernes Overture, a noisy, aggressive, and rather brutal piece by a local composer, Jean Goucher. Schuller's piece, although strictly a 12-tone work, had abundant colors, syncopations a la jazz, imitative effects, and outright humor, and it was received as a welcome change of pace. Laughter and tentative applause erupted during or after 3 of the 7 studies, which in Minneapolis at that time would have been discouraged at concerts as dangerously short-haired, even disrespectful. But the reviews in the Twin Cities dailies all praised the work, and you can see them up on the screen. If any of you are curious about the precise content on them and can't read them as they appear here, I can send you copies. As I listened to the excerpts from my interview with Gunther, I was once again flooded with memory of the great principals that were in the orchestra during Doráti's tenure. Emil Opava, the principal flute, Johnny Angelucci, or Radames to be formal, the principal oboe, and Christopher Luba, the magnificent principal horn of that time. All of them you can hear when we hear the piece in its entirety at the conclusion of these reminiscences, which is about all the reminiscences I have, although I will remember that in addition to the audience reaction, Schuller received a nice round of applause when Doráti brought him on stage for a curtain call.
All right. Thank you, Dennis. Just a brief overview of the premiere recording. The work was released in 1960 as Mercury Living Presence SR 90282, and it was recorded about 5 months after the performance in April of 1960. And I mentioned that to Dennis today when we were talking on the phone, and he said that only the insane would travel to Minneapolis in November to make a recording from a van. because it was cold and the weather was likely not very nice. The recording was made with 3 Schoeps M201 microphones, which was the standard operating procedure with Mercury at that time. And as much as I love this cover on the original LP was not released on a single CD. It was broken up over 2 different CDs. The Schuller was included with the Aaron Copland Rodeo, and the Paul Fettler Contrasts was kind of tacked on the end of a disc of Doráti with the London Symphony Orchestra doing absurdist French music, such as Sete and such. So I think that it didn't sell well in the catalog. I know that, so it probably couldn't have stood on its own as a CD. But the way we're doing Mercury reissues now, we're going back to the original LP sequencing and contents. But in the 90s, the mentality was you fill up 70 minutes on a CD because that's what the CD buying public wants. So a lot of, both Mercury and RCA and also Columbia did this of tacking on other stuff beyond the original LPs, which, as I said, sometimes it works better than other times. But I prefer the original LP thing. I think most listeners also prefer a 45-minute experience with music. That's just my personal opinion. Anyway, though, let's listen to this in the original LP side A, which is Schuller's 7 Studies on the Themes of Paul Klee. And this is from the...
I don't want to interrupt you except to say before we begin to listen to this, I want to put in a word of praise for its companion on the original LP. I knew Paul Fettler. He was a composition teacher at the University of Minnesota, and he was a composer of wonderfully sane music in a traditional vein. And these were 2 examples of what were being achieved in American music in 1959.
And they went well together on an album, don't you think?
Absolutely. But that because, of course, I knew them both. I mean, I'd heard them both in concert, but they seemed to make sense together, particularly with Doráti conducting the Minneapolis Symphony, since they were both his commissions.
Yes. All right. So let's listen to the Schuller piece in its entirety, and I'm going to project the accompanying artwork to each of the studies. But let me just quickly ask: do we have stereo now? Okay. All right. So let's go. We'll start with Antique Harmonies. The silence is deafening. Should we pause for a retake?
Absolutely.
Pause it?
Since it's the main event, we'll all have to be patient.
Yes. Do you all have any questions while we're waiting? Comments? Yes, Sedge.
Dennis, I note the Northrop Auditorium. This is the first time I've ever seen that photo, and it's a huge place. It looks like.
It was built for English lectures and general convocations in 1929, before there was any sound reinforcement. It was remarkably successful for speech and amazingly unsuccessful for music. The Minneapolis Symphony moved there in 1930 because it was cheap. There was a depression just beginning, and they wanted to give up the old hall, which they had built, which is now the site of Orchestra Hall, their permanent home, which was built in 1974. So with Northrop Auditorium, they only had to play one subscription concert because 5,300 people filled up the seats. Now, they never drew more than half of that, but that was as big as a Carnegie Hall audience, so it was good enough for their purposes. And the university offered them the use of it for most of the year, and that meant they could rehearse on stage. There was also a rehearsal room in the basement, and record there after 1933. But it was extensively renovated about 6 years ago to make it smaller. But the orchestra, of course, ceased to play there in 1974. The last concert they played was a performance of Gurlieder with Skrobaczewski, and then the next concert, the next season, began in Orchestra Hall in Minneapolis.
What was Ormandy's comment about it?
No, that was, well, dynamite, same as George Sell in about Avery, well, Philharmonic Hall.
It was very hard to make recordings in Northrop. If you look in the in the Mercury session books, the most notes about things they had to do are involve Northrop. They tried in the mono days. The problem is it's so cavernous that nothing gets picked up on the back of the microphone. The sound just fades into this cavern. So they tried in the mono days folding back the output of the tape machine to a speaker in the middle of the hall, which actually did produce somewhat convincing reverb. You know, for instance, the mono Rite of Spring, one of the best performances of that work and one of the best recordings from that era, highly praised. That has that, they called it foldback reverb, tape foldback reverb.
What they did was they projected a delayed signal through the PA speaker above the teaser curtain over the stage. The problem was that there was so much nonlinearity in that circuit,
Yeah.
combined with the nonlinearity in the Miller cutters of the mono LPs, that it produced a very fierce sound. You can also hear it in Tchaikovsky's Sleeping Beauty. And it isn't really reverb. It's simply a delay which produces the subjective effect of reverb.
Yes.
But ultimately, it was abandoned. Copland Third Symphony has it as well.
Yes. The other thing in the stereo era, they would move the strings way out onto the apron of the stage. And it ended up in the stereo era when you had 3 microphones. The Schoeps microphones were more sensitive. You got more of a hall sound. And, you know, this recording we're about to hear, you know, there's hall sound to it. You can hear the placement of the instruments well. It worked better in stereo than mono, but it was not the favorite hall. Let's put it that way.
After the hall had been built and was being used for about 5 years, they began to put acoustic paneling in the coffers of the ceiling, which was about as bad an idea for music as could have been imagined, because the Ormandy recordings show a genuine reverberation if you listen to them from good source, whereas the Metropolis recordings and all that followed were suffered from a lack of resonance.
Yeah.
So the problem wasn't ever solved.
Great for speech.
Mercury had basically come to terms with it for a stereo image by about 1957, because a recording of Coppelia was very successful from a stereo standpoint and showed a good depth in the room. So by 59, when this was recorded, or 60 more accurately, they were achieving consistent results in stereo that were more successful anyway. You know, they had problems with other venues. Henry and Edsel Ford Auditorium in Detroit was about as abysmal as you can imagine, but
Yeah.
political reasons forced them to use it for when they should have been continuing to use the music hall, which was falling down. And then finally, they admitted defeat in the final Skrobaczewski recordings by moving to Edison High School Auditorium in North Minneapolis, which had a much, much better
Yeah.
acoustic for recording.
Yep. Yep.
Such are the trials of doing location recordings in mediocre spaces.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a try again at listening to this. We will start with Antique Harmonies. Next is Abstract Trio. Little Blue Devil. The Twittering Machine. Arab Village. An eerie moment. And finally, Pastoral. Okay, so that is the end of our presentation. I want to thank my friend Dennis. It was a pleasure working with you on this. I
And
learned
you,
a
Tom.
lot.
Bringing back a very interesting reminiscence in my own musical listening.
Excellent. You made a good point that that final piece, Pastoral, definitely Gunther Schuller listened carefully to Stravinsky and studied the Rite of Spring in particular, which was Dennis's first contact point with him. So, any questions, comments?
Certainly wasn't clear recording, was it?
Pick up the mic and talk into it.
Certainly was a clear recording, wasn't it? And all of the winds passing back and forth were very,
And for
very
all of,
striking.
for me, of course, who knew all of those people individually and had listened to them over many years, some of the sounds just evoked the people so quickly that it was fun to revisit that.
Mm-hmm.
There's no place to hide in that score, is there?
No.
And that was an example of Doráti, who could prepare what was admittedly a somewhat second-rate orchestra in terms of the back stands and the limited number of first violins to achieve well above their level through motivation and proper rehearsal. Because the orchestra played only one subscription concert, they were not under the pressure to have to fit everything into an 8-service week. There was plenty of time for rehearsal, and they used it. And that's why he got the results that he did.
You mentioned that the Sleeping Beauty was somewhat, what they used to try to make it, make the reverberation or something like that was kind of strident. What about the other two, Swan Lake, Nutcracker? Did those sound better?
Well, I think a lot of what Dennis is talking about you hear on the LPs more than you hear on the tapes, because Dennis is right that the resonances of that loudspeaker that they were using to feed back a delayed signal into the hall, combined with the way the bright sound of the Miller Cutter head, especially if you play it back on a modern system with modern speakers, all those early mono LPs are quite, what did you call it?
I'd call them hot in the upper mid-range.
Yeah.
Hot.
Yeah.
I've
Quite
heard
hot.
you say other words than hot before.
Quite.
Nonlinear is the technical term I
Right.
used. But I just want to interrupt long enough to, when we talked about that, I suddenly remembered my first children's concert, which was with Metropolis just before Doráti took over. They still had a teaser curtain above the Northrop stage with a giant sign saying asbestos. We wouldn't be able to get away with that anymore.
In other words, one of the sponsors was the maker of
No,
asbestos.
it was a mark of safety. If you had an asbestos fire curtain, your theater would be much less inclined to go up in smoke because it was fireproof. Its depredations on the human lungs were not known at that time, or if they were suppressed.
That was because of the nitrate films.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of this program, and we certainly thank you for attending and your kind attention during its course. I want to tell you just a little bit about next month's concert. I'm sorry. Too many years of broadcasting orchestra concerts. And now for next week's concert. But if I could have the necessary copy, I'd be able to do this because, of course, being in radio all those years, I really needed a script. Thank you very much.
Don't mind me.
And that is indeed that our next program will be on May 25th. Peter Lawrence will offer an expanded presentation on the International Bibliography of Discographies offered at last year's ARSC National Conference in Bloomington, Indiana. And all reminder that all ARSC New York chapter meetings are free and open to the public. However, we do welcome voluntary contributions to help defray our expenses. And finally, if you are not on our mailing list and wish to be placed on it, please let us know. And you can do that by emailing www.arsk-audio.org. With that, I bid you a good evening.